let me tell you about my first fishing story, okay? This is a beginner's tutorial how to fish. I've never fished a day in my life. My friend says, hey, you want to go fishing with me? I say, sure, why not? Never been before. I show up. She has a can of worms. I'm like, I ain't touching those. You gonna touch those for me? Because I ain't touching them. So she gets my worm out. She puts it on my hook. She's like, all right, this is how you do it. And I was like, all right, sure. So I cast it in there, reeling it in. Okay. It gets caught. And I was like, oh, what do I do now? She says, yank on it. So I'm like, okay. So I'm yanking on it, whatever. So I'm reeling it in, yanking at the same time and trying to get it back in. And I pull it back up and it's just my hook. And I'm like, okay, I lost a worm. This is great. So then she puts another worm on there, and I'm like doing this at the same time. I'm like, I'm not touching this worm. No. So I cast it back out there. I'm reeling it back in. It gets caught again. I was like, oh no. So I reel it back in. I bring it back up. I lost another worm. And I was like, oh, 2 worms down. Okay. So then I move to a log. I sit on my log. She puts another worm on there, and I was like, okay. So I cast it a couple times. I bring it back in. I've saved this worm. I have kept this worm this far. I'm like, this worm has spoke to me. His name is Benfield. So she looks at me and she goes, why Benfield? And I'm like, I don't know. He just said his name is Benfield. Okay. So me and Benfield, we have a bond at this point. So I cast Benfield out. And I'm reeling him back in, and he gets caught on a rock. And I'm like, oh, Benfield, no. So I'm like, Benfield, use your mating call to call out to the fish. And I was like, don't call out to the rocks. So I'm reeling Benfield back in. And I'm yanking at the same time because she tells me to yank. So I'm like yanking and reeling it in and yanking it. Okay. So then I yank one more time and a fish pops up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I caught a fish. So I get the fish and I'm like, oh, his name's Gale. So she looks at me. She goes, why Gale? And I'm like, he just told me his name's Gale. She's like, okay. So I get a picture of me and Gale, and I'm like, me and Benfield and Gale. Benfield's still on the hook. Okay. So we take Gale. He's a baby fish. We take him. We come back in, and I was like, bye, Gale. Have a nice life. So Benfield's still on the hook, and I was like, all right, Benfield, 1 fish down. We can do it again. So I throw him back out, and I was like, use your magic like you did on Gale. And I was like Magic Mike. And she goes, pretty sure that's not how that works. And I'm like, Gale thought otherwise. She thought he was Magic Mike. So I'm reeling him back in. He gets caught on some rocks. And I was like, oh no, Benfield. I know you have a thing for rocks, but we're not here for rocks. We're here for fish. Okay? So at this point, I stand up. Okay? And I'm like, I'm ready. Reeling him back in. Yanking, reeling him back in. And at one point, I just give up. So I just take it behind me and I start tugging. Okay? And then I look behind me, and a fish pops back up, and it's about this big now. And I'm like, oh, I caught another fish. And she just looks at me and goes, I hate you. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. Because during this time, as I'm catching all these fish, her rod and her fishing line is wadded up into a big tangle of fishing line. So she's just like, it's just not my day. And I'm like, you know what? It's mine, apparently. So I look at her, and I'm like, okay, what should we name this fish? And she says, his name's Buddy. And I was like, okay. So we get Buddy, and then we clip Buddy away from the hook, and then she would just throw him back in. And I was like, bye, Buddy. Nice knowing you. So then I have Benfield. And at this time, Benfield has caught 2 fish now. And he is literally barely hanging on for dear life because his body is on the hook, but half of his body is hanging on by a string, and then the other half's just kind of dangling there. So then I sit back on my log, and I cast Benfield a couple of times, and then she looks at me, and she says, my rod, I just give up on it. She was like, can I just use yours? And I was like, sure. And I said, wait, let me say goodbye to Benfield. So I'm like, take a picture of me and Benfield. So I get Benfield, and I'm like, so then I'm like, Benfield, let's go out with a bang. So I throw Benfield back in, and I'm like, we can do this. I was like, go out with the bang, Benfield. I was like, this is your last time. And then he gets caught again, and I was like, Benfield, why? Why, Benfield? So I'm tugging and reeling in and tugging. And I look back at her, and I was like, I think Benfield's a goner. And next thing I know, a huge fish pops up out of the water, grabs Benfield, and swims away. And at this point, I'm like, Benfield, no. And then she just says, at least you got to say goodbye to him. So then I give her my rod, and she tries to catch some fish, but hers does not, she don't catch any. Her worms are not like Benfield. So then we proceed to go home. And at the end of the day, I caught 2 fish, but Benfield caught 3. He lived his best life. And that's the story of my first fishing trip.